It all started with a mistake, one that could cost a man more than just money. James Carter was the kind of person who never worried about misplacing things. He had more than enough wealth to replace whatever went missing. A millionaire businessman, he was used to luxury, fast cars, private jets, and exclusive parties. Losing a watch, he'd buy another. Misplacing a phone, he had 5 more. But tonight was different. James had just returned from a business trip, stepping out of a black luxury car in front of his grand modern home. He was exhausted, running on nothing but caffeine and deals. The night was quiet, except for the soft hum of crickets in the distance. He dragged his suitcase up the driveway, his mind already set on a long shower and a good night's sleep. But then, a sudden realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His other suitcase, the one that mattered, was gone. Not just any suitcase, the one filled with $100,000 in cash. James froze, his heart pounded. He turned on his heels, scanning the car, the driveway, the steps leading to his front door. His driver, who had just started the engine to leave, rolled down the window. "Everything all right, Mr. Carter?" James swallowed hard. "Did you grab the other suitcase?" The small black one. The driver frowned. "No, sir. I only brought the one you gave me." Panic started creeping in. James wasn't the kind of man who panicked easily. But this was bad. He had been carrying the suitcase with him the entire day, never letting it out of his sight, until now. Where had he left it? The airport, the cafe where he had stopped for coffee, the hotel lobby before checking out. He replayed every moment of his day, trying to recall the last time he had the case in his hand. The money wasn't just for him. It was meant for a private deal, one that required cash, no questions asked. Losing it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disaster. James rushed inside, grabbed his phone, and started making calls. The hotel said they hadn't found anything. The cafe had no reports of a lost bag. The airport, a long wait on hold, only to be told there was no sign of it. A sick feeling settled in his stomach. It was gone. Someone had it. He ran a hand through his dark hair, pacing his lavish living room. There was nothing he could do but wait and hope. Hope that whoever found it wasn't the wrong person. Hope that somehow, some way, it would come back to him. But deep down, he knew better. No one would return a suitcase with that much money. Would they? Hours passed. The night stretched on. James sat on his expensive leather couch, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The city outside was silent, sleeping. Then, knock, knock. James snapped, his head toward the door. It was almost midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? His pulse quickened. Could it be? He hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. A woman. Not just any woman. She was stunning. Long dark hair, striking features, an air of quiet confidence. She stood there in the dim porch light, holding his suitcase. James's breath caught in his throat. What was this? A setup? A trick? Why would she bring it back? And more importantly, what did she want in return? He unlocked the door, his voice low, cautious. "Can I help you?" She lifted the suitcase slightly. "I believe this belongs to you." James stared at her, trying to read her expression. Was she serious? What kind of person finds a bag full of cash and just gives it back? His mind raced with questions. Who was she? How did she find him? And most importantly, what was her real motive? James hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who trusted easily, especially not in a situation like this. He studied the woman's face, searching for any sign of deception. But there was nothing. No smugness, no guilt, no hidden agenda in her expression, just calm confidence. As if returning a suitcase full of money was the most normal thing in the world. "Where did you find it?" he asked, his voice cautious. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, observing him just as carefully as he was observing her. "A coffee shop. You must have left it under the table," she said finally. "I was sitting at the next one over." James narrowed his eyes. He had been in such a rush that morning, making calls, juggling meetings. Had he really been that careless? But that, still, didn't explain why she brought it here. "How did you know it was mine?" Her lips curved into a slight smile. "You had a luggage tag with your name on it." She tapped the small tag still attached to the handle. James exhaled, running a hand down his face. He had been on edge since realizing the suitcase was missing. But now that it was back in front of him, a different feeling crept in. Suspicion. She had found it. She had opened it. She had seen what was inside. There was no way she hadn't. James tightened his grip on the door. "And you still decided to return it." This time, her smile faded. "It's not mine. It didn't feel right to keep it." James couldn't remember the last time he had met someone who thought like that. In his world, people didn't give back money. They took it, they used it. They twisted situations to their advantage. He had built his empire on knowing how people worked, how greed controlled them. But here she was, standing in front of him, proving him wrong. She shifted slightly, as if sensing his thoughts. "Aren't you going to take it?" James looked down at the suitcase. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Then slowly, he reached out and took it from her hands. It felt heavier now, as if the situation carried more weight than just the cash inside. "Thank you," he said, keeping his tone measured. She nodded but didn't move. James realized she was still waiting. Not for money. He could tell she didn't expect a reward. No, she was waiting for something else. Honesty, an explanation, anything. But James wasn't ready to give that. "Do you want to come inside?" he asked instead. He wasn't sure why he said it, but the words were already out. She hesitated. "I don't think that's a good idea." James let out a small laugh, stepping aside. "I don't bite." That made her smile, but it didn't. Erase the wariness in her eyes. She looked at him for a moment longer, before finally stepping in, the warmth of the house wrapped around them, contrasting with the crisp night air outside. James set the suitcase down beside the couch, but he could still feel its presence, like a silent reminder of the mess he had almost found himself in. She glanced around. The place was as impressive as one would expect from a millionaire. High ceilings, sleek furniture, expensive art pieces. Yet, something about it felt empty. "You live here alone?" she asked. James smirked. "Is that your way of asking if I have a wife?" She raised an eyebrow. "Just making conversation. No wife, no kids, just me." She nodded as if that answer didn't surprise her. "Not even a pet?" James shook his head. "I travel too much. It wouldn't be fair." She took a slow breath, still looking around. "It's a beautiful place, but it doesn't feel like a home." James studied her, caught off guard by how easily she saw through him. Most people were too busy being impressed by his wealth to notice anything deeper. He leaned against it, the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "You never told me your name." She met his gaze. "Lena." James let the name settle in his mind. Simple, strong, fitting. "So, Lena," he said carefully, "you found a suitcase full of money, brought it back, and now you're standing in my house. That's not a normal night for most people." Lena gave a small chuckle. "It's not a normal night for me either." James watched her closely. There was something about her, something that didn't add up. She didn't seem like someone who would normally get involved in a situation like this. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice quieter now. "Do you think about keeping it?" Lena didn't answer right away. She looked at him, then at the suitcase, then back at him. "Of course I did," she admitted finally. "Anyone would." James nodded, appreciating the honesty. "So why didn't you?" Lena hesitated, as if she was debating whether to say the words out loud. But then she sighed. "Because I know what it's like to lose something important." Something in her voice shifted. It wasn't about the money. James could tell. This was personal. "What did you lose?" he asked. She looked down for a moment, then back up at him. "Someone." James didn't push. He knew that kind of loss. The kind that leaves an invisible weight on your shoulders. It was the only thing money couldn't fix. The room fell into silence. Then, a loud thud. Outside, James and Lena both snapped their heads toward the front door. It wasn't just a random sound. It was deliberate. Close. Someone was out there. James moved quickly, reaching for his phone, but Lena grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Wait!" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if they're looking for the suitcase?" James's stomach tightened. She had a point. If someone knew about the money, if someone had been watching, then this wasn't over. Not even close. James held his breath, listening. The sound outside had been too close. Someone was definitely there. Lena's grip on his arm tightened, and he could feel the tension in her fingers. A second thud, this time near the window. James exchanged a look with Lena. He wasn't a man who scared easily. But this situation was different. The suitcase, the money, the timing of it all. Someone knew. Someone had been watching. His first instinct was to grab the suitcase and hide it. But would that even help? If someone had come looking for it, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. Lena leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you have security cameras?" James nodded. "They don't cover the side of the house." Whoever's out there knew that. Lena exhaled sharply. "They're not just some random person then." The realization sent a chill down James's spine. He had enemies, competitors, people who didn't like the way he did business. But who would know about the money? The only other person who had seen inside that suitcase was standing right next to him. James turned to her, his eyes searching. "Lena, is there something you're not telling me?" She shook her head, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes. Before he could press further, bang! The front door shook violently, as if someone had slammed against it. James's body went rigid. Whoever was outside wasn't here to talk. He grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her toward the back hallway. "Come on." She didn't argue. They moved quickly, slipping through the shadows of the house, their footsteps barely making a sound against the polished floors. James's mind was racing. He needed to take control of this situation before it escalated. They reached the back exit, but just as James reached for the door handle, a deep voice called out from the front, "Mr. Carter." James froze. The voice was calm. Too calm. Whoever it was, they knew him. He turned slightly, exchanging a glance with Lena. Her expression was tight, her jaw clenched. "Open the door, James." The voice continued, "I know you're in there." James inhaled slowly. He didn't recognize the voice, but the way the man spoke, it wasn't a bluff. This was someone serious. Lena's voice was low. "We can't just stand here." James thought fast. Running wasn't an option. Whoever was outside was expecting him to be afraid, expecting him to hesitate. He wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. He let go of Lena's hand and turned back toward the front door. "Stay here," he said firmly. Lena grabbed his wrist. "James, I can handle this." Her eyes searched his, but after a moment, she let go. James walked toward the door, steadying his breath, keeping his expression unreadable. He unlocked it and pulled it open just enough to see who was on the other side. A man stood there, tall, dressed in a dark suit, his hands in his pockets. He had a look of quiet authority, the kind of presence that didn't need to be loud to be threatening. Behind him, another man, larger, built like a bodyguard, stood with his arms crossed. James met the first man's eyes. "You lost?" The man smirked. "Not at all." His gaze flickered past James, scanning the house. "Nice place." James kept his expression neutral. "Thanks, but I don't do house tours this late." The man let out a soft chuckle. "Fair. Enough." Then he tilted his head slightly. "You have something of mine." James felt the tension coil in his chest. He knew exactly where this was going. "I don't think so," he said coolly. The man's smirk didn't fade. He gestured toward the house. "Mind if we come in?" "I think you do." James tightened his grip on the door. "I do mind, actually." A long pause. The man studied him, his smirk slowly fading. "You're making this difficult." James held his ground. "If you had something of value in that suitcase, you should have kept a better eye on it." The man's expression hardened, and for the first time, the bodyguard behind him shifted slightly, as if ready to act. But before things could escalate further, a voice rang out from behind James. "If you're looking for the money, it's gone." James turned sharply. "Lena." She stepped forward, standing beside him. The man's eyes flickered with interest. "And you are?" Lena ignored the question. "You're wasting your time. We already moved the money." James tensed. What was she doing? The man arched an eyebrow. "That's so." Lena nodded, her expression unwavering. "You think James would be stupid enough to keep that much cash sitting in his house?" The man studied her, his gaze calculating. Then, after a moment, he exhaled. "Smart." James could hardly believe it. Was this actually working? The man glanced back at his bodyguard, then stepped back slightly. "All right, we'll be in touch, Mr. Carter." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his bodyguard following. James shut the door, locking it behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. He turned to Lena. "That was a hell of a gamble," she exhaled, running, a hand through her hair. "It worked, didn't it?" James let out a small, breathless laugh. He had to admit, he was impressed. Lena met his gaze. "Who was that?" James shook his head. "Someone I don't want to owe anything to." Lena nodded slowly. "Then I guess we both got lucky tonight." James studied her for a long moment. She had walked into his life out of nowhere, changed the course of his night, and somehow, against all logic, had just saved him from what could have been a dangerous situation. He smirked. "You ever thought about a career in negotiations?" Lena chuckled. "No, but maybe I should." James let out a deep breath. The danger had passed, but the night had left its mark. He looked at Lena, realizing something. She wasn't just some woman who had returned his suitcase. She was something else, something rare. And for the first time in a long time, James Carter felt like he had met someone he couldn't quite figure out. Maybe he didn't want to.